Welcome to the Ruthless Criticism Podcast. This is a podcast which examines the work and ideas of Karl Marx as it relates to various topics. Today we're addressing a question that is something of a holdover from yesterday's podcast, the first podcast of this channel. And it was raised within the same thread as all the other questions that were addressed yesterday. And I'm addressing it mostly because I do consider it to be related, not only in why the question arose, but also to some of the topic of discussion yesterday. The particular phrasing of the question that's in use here is by Toxic 911, who flares themselves as a minarchist. And the question verbatim is, how can you draw the line between private and personal property? Putting aside the fact that this user seems to be assuming that I draw such a line, or assuming that I really care to draw such a line, I think it's fair to say that those who present the idea of personal property as a distinct concept from private property have drawn a clear enough line. It's my understanding that the argument basically goes something like, private property is any form of good or materials, land included in that, natural resources, that is essentially controlled in absentia, and which is not used directly by the person in question who is considered the quote-unquote owner. So it's not something that they need to fulfill their daily wants and needs. This type of property is then contrasted with property which is directly used by the individual. So for example, right now I'm making use of my computer, I'm making use of my microphone and all the various equipment that I'm using to record this at this present time. So put in its simplest terms, that is precisely where the line is being drawn. Seems to me that the question that is of larger concern to those people who criticize this view is not so much where the line is drawn. I think it's easy enough to draw that line, but where to interpret certain uses of property with respect to that line. And this is where I think a general sort of confusion begins to set in. So for example, if you have a house and one of those rooms within that house is empty, despite the fact that you use the remainder of the house as your personal space in which you conduct your daily life and perhaps your family conducts its daily life, what rights do you as the owner of the house then have with respect to the room that is not in use? Part of the reason I don't find this distinction to be particularly useful is because I don't think it's really relevant to a society that has moved beyond the current bourgeois property relations. There's an underlying question as to whether or not someone has a right to exchange in this circumstance. So a right to rent the empty room out for a period of time to another individual in society. In another, perhaps more concrete example, there's a question in this regard as to whether or not someone would have rights of ownership over a factory when clearly they are not making use of the whole factory. Even if they were to make some directly productive use of it, they're clearly not in need of an entire factory all to themselves. The tools that would be used are not necessarily always being used by that person simultaneously. There's a general question of where does use begin and where does use end. And it's not difficult to see that this can be extended into things that would traditionally be recognized almost wholly as personal property under this definition. So for example, a vehicle. If you drive to work and your car sits around for 8 hours in a parking lot while you're at work, you're not using the car at that given time. So just like a factory owner perhaps who doesn't use all the machines at any given time, but maybe occasionally goes in and entertains use of the machines for whatever reason, would that person maintain any rights to exclude others from use of that thing, particularly during the time in which it's not being used? and not only to exclude, but would they be in the right to perhaps hire outside laborers to make use of it or to rent it out for use to others? And we can begin to see pretty clearly that this distinction of personal versus private property is making essentially all the same assumptions of bourgeois property relations that currently exist. That is, there's an assumption already that productive relations have not moved beyond the capital versus labor antagonism. And in this respect, I would regard any society that was required to make this distinction as having not moved beyond those social relations. And I think historically that is probably the most accurate way to understand this, because if my understanding is correct, this argument essentially originates with Proudhon. And Marx's criticism of Proudhon was essentially that he hadn't changed anything in his conception of how humanity moves beyond the social relations of capitalism. Rather, he had succumbed to what amounted to sort of a mere rephrasing of capitalist productive relations and a different presentation with the same essential nature found at its core. With that said, what I tend to be more interested in is really the claim that this is a Marxist idea. To me, it seems a rather dubious claim that is often made by those with a slightly more libertarian streak, perhaps some anarchist influences, but it is also not a claim that has in any way, shape, or form escaped other aspects of the traditional sort of Marxist lineage. That is to say, it's not beyond someone who would identify as a Leninist or a Marxist-Leninist, aka Stalinist, to uphold this distinction as if it's relevant to a future communist or socialist society. So yesterday I made mention of a section within the manifesto that I actually believe to be Marx's most concise and simultaneously thorough description of his concept of property. I'd like to share now that section of the manifesto. If you'd like to follow along, this can be found in the second chapter of the manifesto titled Proletarians and Communists. It's about the 13th or 14th paragraph down, and each paragraph is really about a sentence at this point in the writing. And Marx begins essentially by pointing out that the theory of communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There is no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it, and is still destroying it daily. Or do you mean modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborer? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e. the kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon condition of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist is to have not only a purely personal, but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society can it be set in motion. Capital is therefore not only personal, it is a social power. When therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is the minimum wage, i.e. that quantum of the means of subsistence which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What therefore the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the product of labor, an appropriation that is made for the maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do away with is the miserable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only insofar as the interest of the ruling class requires it." End quote. I think it's important to begin by recognizing that within this quote, Marx is only addressing two forms of property. And in contrast to what is often presented as him addressing the private property and personal property concepts of the people who are promoting this distinction, what he's really addressing is a former type of property, that of the petty artisan, as he calls it, and modern bourgeois property. He doesn't recognize within the quote any other forms of property, and he in fact goes on to say that when examining bourgeois property, there are two sides with which to examine. The first side is, of course, the side of the capitalist. The second side, however, is the side of the wage laborer, that is, the wage that they receive and the goods which they appropriate with that wage. Now, it's important to point out here that Marx does not refer to the goods that they appropriate with that wage as property. Rather, he only refers to capital as property. And rather than refer to the wages or the goods that the wages purchase as property, he refers to this only as the other side of capital, that is, the other side of bourgeois property. So there is no property that is personal or that is the wage laborers. He quite clearly asks, although rhetorically, does wage labor create any property for the laborer? And then answers, not a bit. So if wage labor doesn't create any property for the worker, then what is this personal property which is being spoken of? When Marx later refers to personal property in the very quote that we read, what he's referring to is the hypothetical personal property that his bourgeois critic is talking about. A property that Marx is quite clearly saying isn't actually a real form of property. Rather, it's an idealized form of property that the bourgeois critic has created in order to try and defend bourgeois property relations. Having asked his critic the number of rhetorical questions regarding what does he mean by this, he concludes then that essentially no such property exists, therefore it's impossible to abolish. Rather, the only property that exists is bourgeois property, i.e. capital, and because capital is already a social power, it cannot be converted from a personal to a social power. Rather, only its social character can change. Indeed, just prior to the portion that we read, Marx could be said to be even clearer. He says, "The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products that is based on class antagonisms, on the exploitation of the many by the few." What's important to note here is that Marx says and appropriating products. So he's not simply talking about the mode of production, he's talking about the mode of distribution as well. And for Marx, the mode of distribution is intimately tied to the mode of production, as he states in Critique of the Gotha program. Quote, "Any distribution, whatever of the means of consumption, is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. The latter distribution, however, is a feature of the mode of production itself. The capitalist mode of production, for example, rests on the fact that the material conditions of production are in the hands of non-workers, in the form of property in capital and land, while the masses are only owners of the personal condition of production, of labor power. If the elements of production are so distributed, then the present-day distribution of the means of consumption results automatically. If the material conditions of production are the cooperative property of the workers themselves, then there likewise results a distribution of the means of consumption different from the present one." Note again here that Marx is clearly distinguishing what the proletariat has ownership over. In this case, labor power. So is this what those who are distinguishing between personal property and private property mean? Are we to assume that when they say personal property, they're referencing only the labor power of an individual? And if that's the case, when they say that we would not abolish personal property, what else could they possibly be saying other than that nothing will change? That is to say that the worker will continue having the personal property which they've always had, namely their side of the capital coin, their labor power. At the core of this is the fact that capital doesn't persist unless the wage laborer appropriates the products of the capitalist mode of production. That is to say, when we talk about production and distribution being intertwined, you can't separate the fact that the wage labor has to appropriate these products. It's in this very relationship, and they need to appropriate these products in order to subsist, that capital is reproduced. It's only in that relationship that the value of the wages can sink below the value of the products that the person produces. If the wage laborer had no requirement to purchase the products of capitalist mode of production, then capital would not persist, and there would be an implicit assumption that the means of production were already accessible. That is, that the laborer was free to produce for themselves or free to associate with their fellow producers in order to produce for their own needs and wants independent of the capital relationship. In this respect, the products that the wage laborer appropriates by means of their wage is not the personal property of the wage laborer. Rather, it's simply the other side of capital. If you like this podcast or you found it insightful in any way, please leave a comment, thumbs up, and as always, make sure that you subscribe.